Before I tell you what happened on that plane, I need you to stop everything you are doing right now and stay exactly where you are. Because what you are about to hear is the kind of story that does not release you once it has you. A man raised his hand inside a private jet at 35,000 feet and slapped a woman clean across the face in front of a full cabin of people. He did it slowly. He did it with his ring still on his finger. He did it like the altitude had put him above every consequence that existed at ground level. And then he fixed his jacket and looked out the window like the ocean below was more interesting than what he had just done. He was wrong to think that. Because seated 4 rows behind him, separated by nothing but a thin cabin curtain and an untouched glass of palm wine, was a woman whose name had made 3 multinational corporations restructure their entire legal architecture in a single quarter. A woman who set down that glass, uncrossed her ankles, and stood up with the particular stillness of someone who had already decided exactly what was going to happen next before anyone else in that cabin had finished flinching. What that man did not know, what no one on that plane knew, was that the woman sitting with her hand pressed to her burning cheek was this woman's younger sister. And that the woman standing up had spent the past 11 days building a case that was going to bring down every single thing he had quietly been constructing for 2.5 years. This is her story. Every layer, every betrayal, every moment of reckoning that was a very long time coming. Stay with me. By the time we reach the end, I promise you, everything you thought you understood about this will have turned completely upside down. Before we go any further, drop your location in the comments right now. Your city, your country, what time it is where you are. I read every single one. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit that button and turn on your notifications because you do not want to miss a story like this one. Now, let us get into it. My name is Ifeoma. I am 33 years old. My mother is Igbo, from Anambra State, a woman who taught secondary school for 26 years and raised 4 children on the conviction that the sharpest thing a person can carry into any room is a prepared mind. My father is Korean, from Busan, a former maritime trade attorney who retired early and spent his remaining years teaching my siblings and me to read a contract the way a surgeon reads a scan, looking not for what is there, but for what is missing. I became an intellectual property lawyer because I was, from a very young age, extraordinarily good at finding the thing that did not belong. I could walk into a room full of documents and locate the single page that someone had hoped nobody would reach within 20 minutes. That skill made me useful. It also made me dangerous to certain kinds of people, and I had learned over the years that those were usually the same people. My sister Ifeoma is 3 years younger than me. She is everything I present to the world that I am not, warm in a way that rooms respond to, quick with laughter, the kind of person who makes strangers feel immediately that they have known her for years. She married Kwon Dae-hoon 18 months ago in a ceremony held at a resort in Jeju that our mother described, with extreme composure, as unnecessarily expensive. Dae-hoon was the second son of the Kwon family, whose electronics conglomerate had expanded over 4 decades from manufacturing components in Incheon into a sprawling group with holdings across Southeast Asia, West Africa, and Europe. He was handsome in the way that men are handsome when they have never needed anything from anybody, and he had spent his entire adult life moving through spaces that accommodated him before he arrived. The private charter was organized by the Kwon Group for their biannual partnership summit. 12 executives for family members supporting legal staff. The destination was Lagos, where the Kwon Group was finalizing a co-development agreement with a Nigerian tech infrastructure company called Zella Systems. My name was on the manifest as independent IP legal counsel, retained by the Kwon family to review the Zella agreement before signing. That was true. What was also true, and what nobody on that plane except one person knew, was that I had been contacted 11 days earlier by someone inside the Kwon Group who had seen something in Zella Systems' patent portfolio that did not match what was being presented at the summit table. That person was Kwon Seokyeon, Dae-hoon's older brother, the man behind the curtain. The slap happened 40 minutes into the flight. I was seated in business class, reviewing the 3rd section of the Zella patent filings on my laptop, when the sound came through the cabin. That particular, unmistakable crack that silences a room before anyone has decided to be silent. I looked up. Ifeoma was sitting 2 rows ahead of me, her hand already rising toward her cheek, her face turned from the impact. Dae-hoon was already looking back out the window. The other passengers were doing the specific thing that people do when they witness something they do not want to have witnessed, making themselves smaller, suddenly fascinated by their drinks and their screens. I closed my laptop. I stood up. I walked to Chioma's row, crouched beside her seat, and looked at her face. She would not meet my eyes immediately. She was doing the thing I had watched her learn to do over the past year, reorganizing her expression, composing herself back into someone who was fine. Ife, she said quietly. It is fine.
It is not, I said.
Dae-hoon turned from the window at that point. He looked at me with the mild interest of a man who had determined I was not a significant variable. This is a family matter, he said. I looked at him. Just looked. The kind of look that does not argue and does not threaten and does not need to do either of those things because it is already carrying something larger than both. Then the curtain at the front of the cabin moved. It moved slowly, not dramatically. The way a curtain moves when someone on the other side has placed one hand on it and is pulling it back with unhurried, complete intention. And Kwon Seok-hyun stepped through. He was wearing a dark navy suit.
Notie.
He was holding nothing. He moved through the cabin without looking at the other passengers, and the other passengers, at least the ones who recognized him, which was most of them, went very, very still. Seok-hyun was 38. He had run the Kwon Group's international division for 6 years. He had a reputation in 3 industries for being extraordinarily calm in situations that caused other people to become loud. Boardrooms described him the way weather forecasters describe a pressure system, not violent, simply total. He stopped beside Chioma's row. He looked at me first. Is she hurt? His voice was low, the kind of quiet that does not need volume to fill space. I looked at Chioma. She had gone very still. Something had shifted in her face. Not relief exactly, but the particular expression of someone who has been holding a heavy thing alone for a long time and has just felt another hand come underneath it. We are managing, I said. He held my eyes for a moment. Then he turned and looked at Dae-hoon for the first time. He did not speak immediately. He simply looked. And in that look I saw something I recognized, because I had felt it myself 11 days ago when I first understood what the Zella filings actually contained. Not anger. Something far more precise, and therefore far more serious than anger. We'll speak when we land, he said to Dae-hoon. Then he turned and walked back through the curtain. Dae-hoon laughed after a moment. The laugh of a man trying to recover the temperature of the room. Nobody in the cabin laughed with him. I sat beside Chioma for the remainder of the flight. She eventually let me take her hand. Neither of us said very much. Some things simply require one person to move over and close the distance. Let me tell you what I had found in those 11 days. Zella Systems was a Lagos-based technology company with a genuinely impressive patent portfolio. Wireless infrastructure compression technology that, if fully licensed, would reduce data transmission costs across the African continent by a projected 38%. The Kwon Group was acquiring a controlling stake. The deal was enormous. The kind of deal that gets written about in industry publications for years afterward. The problem was on page 77 of the primary patent filing. A single registration reference number.
Small.
Formatted correctly. Completely unremarkable to anyone who is not cross-checking it against the West African Intellectual Property Database, which I had been doing for 6 days straight because Seok-hyun's message had said simply, something in the filings does not belong. Find it before Thursday. The reference number pointed to a patent that had been filed originally not by Zella Systems, but by a university research department in Ibadan 3 years earlier. The university's IP ownership of that foundational technology had never been formally transferred. There was a transfer agreement in the Zella filing, clean, properly formatted, signed by both parties, but the signatory on the university side was not the vice-chancellor who held authority over IP transfers during that period. It was a deputy registrar whose authorization scope had explicitly excluded intellectual property decisions. The transfer was technically void, which meant the foundational patent Zella Systems had built its entire portfolio on did not legally belong to Zella Systems. The Kwon Group was about to pay $840 million for a technology portfolio whose central pillar had no valid legal foundation. I kept reading. By day 7, I had found the deputy registrar. He had retired 14 months ago and relocated to Canada. I found his financial records through a legal database channel that most people do not know exists. He had received 3 payments totaling the equivalent of $60,000 over a 6-month period beginning 4 months before the fraudulent transfer was signed. The payments came from a consulting company registered in Seychelles. It took me 2 more days to trace the Seychelles company to its true beneficial owner through a chain of nominee directors and bearer-share arrangements that someone had constructed with genuine sophistication. When I found the name at the end of that chain, I sat back from my desk and stared at the ceiling for a very long time. The beneficial owner of the Seychelles Consulting Company, the entity that had paid a retired Nigerian deputy registrar to sign a fraudulent IP transfer worth hundreds of millions of dollars, was a woman named Madame Kwon Jung-suk, Dae-hoon's mother, Sia-kyun's mother, the matriarch of the Kwon family. The Lagos summit was scheduled for the morning following our arrival. The Zella Systems team, the Kwon Group's executive board, and the signing council would all be in the same room at 9 o'clock for the formal agreement ceremony. I did not sleep that night. Sia-kyun found me in the hotel corridor at 6 in the morning. He was already dressed. He looked like a man who had also not slept. "You found it," he said. It was not a question. "I found all of it," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "How far does it go?" I looked at him. The man who had contacted me 11 days ago. The man who had stood through a curtain on a plane and asked if my sister was hurt before he did anything else. The man whose mother's name was at the end of a very long and very carefully constructed chain of fraud. "It goes to a place," I said, "that is going to be very painful for you specifically." He held my eyes. "Tell me." I told him. All of it. The foundational patent, the deputy registrar, the payments, the Seychelles company, the name. He did not interrupt once. When I finished, he stood completely still in the corridor for what felt like a long time. The expression on his face was the expression of a man receiving information his mind had already half prepared for and finding that half preparation had not been sufficient. "She did not know what Dae-hoon is," he said finally. "And Dae-hoon does not know what she did." "I know," I said, because I had worked that out too. Dae-hoon had been positioned as the deal's public face, without being given the full picture of how the deal had been prepared. He was a front, used by his own mother, kept presentable and ignorant, and therefore deniable. The fraud had been constructed above him, not by him. That did not excuse what he had done to Ifeoma on that plane, but it was the truth of the shape of things. "What do you need from me?" Sia-kyun asked. "I need you to walk into that summit room," I said, "and I need you to introduce me correctly." The conference room at 9 a.m. was bright and large, with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over Lagos Island and the Atlantic beyond it. The Zella Systems team were already seated. Their CEO, a composed man named Mr. Chukwemeka Obi, who had built the company from a university spin-out into a continent-scale infrastructure story, sat at the head of his side of the table with the confidence of a man 3 hours away from the largest payday of his life. I felt something complicated looking at him, because Mr. Obi, I had concluded by 2 a.m., did not know either. He had acquired Zella Systems from its founders 4 years ago. The fraudulent transfer had been executed before his involvement. Someone had sold him a company with a poison foundation, and he had spent 4 years building something extraordinary on top of it without knowing the ground beneath him was not solid. He was not the villain of the story. He was another victim of it who did not yet know he was one. The Kwon Group team filed in. Madame Kwon took her seat along the senior side of the table, cream blazer, composed hands, the posture of a woman who had spent decades in rooms like this one and found them comfortable. Dae-hoon sat beside her. He had not looked at me since the plane. Sia-kyun entered last. He stood at the head of the Kwon side and said, before anyone had opened a document, that he wished to introduce a correction to the session's agenda. He said the formal review of the agreement had revealed concerns requiring presentation before any signing could proceed. He said those concerns would be presented by the Kwon Group's independent IP counsel. He looked at me. "My name is Ifeoma Kwon," I said. "And let that land for exactly 3 seconds. I am Sia-kyun's wife. I am also the independent IP lawyer retained to review this agreement." And I need to walk this room through something important before we go any further. The silence had texture. Madame Kwan's face did something precise and small. The kind of micro-movement that only happens when a person receives information they have been genuinely afraid of receiving. Dae-hoon looked between Seok-yeon and me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of a person who is finally understanding that a room they thought they controlled had actually been arranged around them by someone else entirely. I presented for 19 minutes. I did not raise my voice once. I walked them through the foundational patent first. The university filing, the authorized transfer process that had not been followed, the deputy registrar's signature, and the exact scope of authorization he had not possessed when he signed. I placed the relevant university charter provisions on the table in front of the Zello legal team. I gave Mr. Obi his own copy. His face changed slowly as he read. The color did not leave it suddenly. It drained with the gradual, terrible patience of someone understanding something large. Then I walked them through the payments, the consulting company, the Seychelles registration, the beneficial ownership chain. I placed the financial records in front of the Kwan side of the table. I placed the final document, the beneficial ownership certificate, directly in front of Madame Kwan. She looked at it. She did not pick it up. She looked at it the way someone looks at a thing they put somewhere carefully and assume nobody would ever find. Then I told the room that copies of the full evidence package had been submitted to the Nigerian Investment Promotion Commission, the Korean Financial Intelligence Unit, and the relevant IP enforcement bodies in both countries at 7:30 that morning. This room, I said, closing my folder, is not where a decision gets made. The decision has already been made by the evidence. What happens in this room is that everyone present understands their position clearly before they take their next step. I sat down. The room took a long time to come back to itself. Mr. Chukwemeka Obi spoke first, which I had not expected. He stood, straightened his jacket, and said that Zella Systems would be commissioning an independent review of all its foundational IP documentation going back to inception. He said the company would cooperate fully with regulatory authorities. He said the summit was adjourned pending the outcome of that review. He spoke with the dignity of a man who had just discovered a fault line running under everything he had built and had decided, in real time and in front of 20 people, that the building would not fall. I respected him for that more than I had words to say. Madame Kwan remained at the table long after the room had emptied. Seok-yeon stayed. I stayed. Dae-hoon had left early, walking out without looking at either of us, with the particular posture of a man who has just understood that the ground under his feet is not where he thought it was. She looked at me across the empty table. Not with hostility. With something stripped of all its performance. Exhaustion, I thought. The deep, structural exhaustion of a woman who had held something heavy for a very long time and had finally had it taken from her hands. Not gently, but completely. He told me the deal would not happen without it, she said. Who told you?
Seok-yeon asked.
She looked at her son for a long time. Director Lim. He said the foundational patent would not clear due diligence without the transfer. He said the university would not move through proper channels in time. He said it was a formality. I had already known Director Lim's name for 36 hours. He was the Kwan Group's head of acquisitions. He had been the one to bring the Zella deal to the board. He had been the one to recommend the legal team that had cleared the documentation. And I had discovered at 4 a.m. the previous morning, a silent financial stake in a competitor company that would have benefited significantly if the Kwan Group's Zella acquisition had collapsed in fraud scandal after signing. The fraud had not been designed to benefit Madame Kwan. She had been the instrument of it, used, as her son had been used, by a man who understood both of them well enough to know exactly which levers to pull. Director Lim is going to be arrested, I said, before this week is finished. She closed her eyes briefly. I should have asked you, she said to Seok-yeon. I should have come to you first. He was quiet for a moment. Then, yes. Not cruelly, just honestly. The way people speak to each other when all the performance has been removed from a room and only the truth is left to sit in. Ifeoma found me on the hotel terrace that evening. She sat beside me with 2 bottles of cold water and handed one over, without asking. We watched the Lagos skyline for a while, without talking. The city at dusk makes a particular kind of sound, layered and continuous, and entirely its own. Is it finished? She asked eventually. The legal part is beginning, I said. The rest depends on what you decide. She was quiet for a long moment. I have been deciding for 2 months, she said. I just needed to know. I had somewhere to land. I looked at her. You always had somewhere to land. She leaned her head against my shoulder. We sat there in the warm Lagos evening, 2 women raised between 2 worlds that did not always know what to do with each other, and I thought about what her mother used to say at the kitchen table in Akka, in the voice she used when she wanted something to stay with us. The sharpest thing you can carry into any room is a prepared mind. Ifeoma filed for divorce on the following Tuesday. Director Lim was arrested on Wednesday. Madame Kwan made a full voluntary statement to authorities on Thursday and, through her own attorney, initiated a restitution arrangement with the University of Ibadan's IP office that would fund 3 years of their research department's operations. The Zella Systems deal was suspended pending a full reconstruction of its IP foundation, a process that, once the fraudulent transfer was properly vacated and a legitimate transfer negotiated directly with the university, took 4 months and produced an agreement that Mr. Obi later described in a press interview as the most solid foundation his company had ever stood on. Seok-hyun and I announced our marriage publicly on a Friday evening via a single, short statement.
No photograph.
No press event. His world was becoming safe enough for the truth now. We had been building toward that for a year. That evening, sitting at the kitchen table of our sole apartment with the city outside the window going dark and quiet, he made tea and set a cup beside my hand without interrupting what I was writing. I noticed. I always noticed. I think about that cabin sometimes. The sound that silence makes when 30 people decide not to have heard something. The way Ifeoma held her face, so carefully. The curtain that moved slowly and without drama. And I think about the woman I was on that plane, not diminished, not invisible, but carrying something that had not yet landed. Carrying it with her head up and her eyes open and her laptop full of 77 pages of evidence that was about to change everything. She did not need saving. She had never needed saving. She needed someone to step through a curtain and ask if her sister was hurt. And she needed the sharpest thing she had ever carried to be ready in her hands when the moment came. Both of those things were true. Both of those things were enough. If this story held you from the first line all the way to this moment, that is exactly what this channel is here for. Stories about women who do the reading. Stories about people who find the loose thread and follow it without flinching. Stories where justice does not arrive loudly, but arrives completely. Drop your city and your country in the comments right now. Tell me what time it is where you are. I read every single one, and I love knowing where in the world this community reaches. If you are not subscribed, please hit that button right now and turn on your notifications. Every week there is a new story. You do not want to miss a single one. I will see you in the next one.